I wanted to look back and revisit the card that changed everything for me. That changed the perspective of the sport for me, my love of the sport, the hype and excitement and interest that I had. This card right here, UFC 300, elevated everything for me. Perhaps the most stacked, one of the most stacked for sure that we've ever received from the UFC, as well as a card that just delivered in every sense of the spectacle, right? Some cards could be extremely well stacked and layered with perfection and names, but sometimes it just doesn't deliver. But this card right here definitely delivered, and I wanted to look back and review this card exactly 1 year later, from April 13th, 2024 to now, to look back at this legendary card and for people to just understand how this card ended up being like one of the most legendary cards of all time. And you have so many former champions on this card, as well as fighters on this card that people maybe back then didn't see the future looking bright. But now, when you look in a year from now, obviously a lot has changed. A lot of pay-per-views have happened. We're already up to 314. And yeah, I mean, this card was sensational and literally changed everything for me. Like, it was really this card right here that made me fall in love with the experience of getting together with the boys, pulling up, and watching a fight night together. This card was that card that began that tradition that we have every single month where we get together and watch UFC fight nights, meaning the pay-per-views mostly. And yeah, this card was crazy. So I wanted to look back on it, and let's start with the first fight that happened on UFC 300, the main card opener. Now, just to give some context, UFC 300, of course, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of anticipation for such a card, right? 300. It means 100 pay-per-views have passed since 200. Or you'd like to say 99 pay-per-views. So the UFC was going on an incredible run, by the way. Around this time last year, UFC had such a great consecutive card run. 297 was actually really bad with Sean Strickland versus DDP1. But then they gave us 298 in Anaheim with Volk and Ilya, the first card. Extremely stacked card with Yan and Merab on that card. Whitaker versus Costa. Great card. Ilya ended up chinning Volk to get the belt, and that began the legendary story of Ilya Topuria. Then you move on to UFC 299 in Miami. Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera. That was Sean O'Malley's first title defense in Miami. Dustin Poirier in the co-main event. Great win over Saint Denis. Who else did we have? Petr Yan versus Song Yadong. Oh yeah, Merab and Cejudo was on 298. So it was Petr Yan versus Song Yadong. You had Dustin Poirier on there. Just incredible card, UFC 299. And then you move on to UFC 300. And there were so many circulating rumors of who's going to be on this card. And ultimately, when they did fully announce it, people were a little bit underwhelmed. People expected a lot more name value, a lot more of the bigger names and stars on this card for UFC 300. But this video is to show that, you look at it from a year later, and this card just, all the fighters on this card grew, the majority grew tremendously in terms of their star power. To now where they're prominent players in the game, like Diego Lopes, who else? Arman Tsarukyan. These guys are all challenging for belts now. Deiveson Figueiredo is a prominent bantamweight fighter now. So this card, that's what we're about to go through. Every single fight to really just appreciate how insanely layered this card was. In my opinion, really, just how great this card was. So let's start with the first fight of the night. Deiveson Figueiredo versus Cody Garbrandt. Now, we all know Cody Garbrandt, what's his nickname? The Heartbreak Kid or something? But Cody Garbrandt was a former champion. He did have his hype back in the earlier days. His big rivalry with TJ Dillashaw. He beat Dominic Cruz. So Cody Garbrandt was a name, right? And then you put on Deiveson Figueiredo, a former flyweight champion who had an incredible run in the flyweight division. And this was his bantamweight debut. So that was a pretty big deal. So this, for a main card opener, was pretty insane. Two former champions, bantamweight, going at it. Cody Garbrandt was a big name. And Deiveson Figueiredo, the God of War, as they call him. So this opened up the card. Deiveson Figueiredo gets his bantamweight debut win via round 2 submission versus Cody Garbrandt. Kind of an underwhelming performance by Cody Garbrandt, but Deiveson Figueiredo very impressive. And he went on to win his other fight versus Chito Vera. And in his last fight, though, he lost to Peter Yan. But I think he won like 3 straight had 3 straight wins in the bantamweight division. So Deiveson Figueiredo is a very skilled fighter. Cody Garbrandt, we're not really sure where he's holding now. I mean, he kind of fell off. He hasn't fought in a long time. I don't think he's ever getting back at a belt, but that's a good, for the prelims. This is the early prelims of UFC 300, and this is the first fight of the night. The next fight, okay, King Green versus Jim Miller, kind of a vet fight to just throw in there. King Green had kind of a big run at one point in the UFC. He goes and fights Islam Makhachev for a fight night. Can you believe that was a headliner? And he goes on and fights Jim Miller. Jim Miller is a legend. He's been around for UFC 100 and 200, so he's the only fighter to be on all 3 cards. So Jim Miller, they were going to put him on 300, and they paired him up with King Green, but King Green ended up getting a win. Jim Miller actually won his last fight, and now he's fighting Chase Hooper, or not, but as I'm making this video, Jim Miller is scheduled to fight Chase Hooper. And then you got King Green and then King Green, yeah. So King Green, of course, since then, he's lost every single fight. He lost to Paddy Pimblett, just lost to Mauricio Ruffi. And yeah, dropped his 3 out of his last 4. And Jessica Andrade versus Marina Rodriguez, okay. Kind of a ranked women's strawweight bout. Jessica Andrade has some familiar. Okay, she's familiar with the UFC fan base in the women's world of MMA. Then you move on to Jalen Turner versus Renato Moicano. Now, at the time, this was a pretty good fight. Renato Moicano, of course, has been around. Very entertaining on the mic. Following this win, he beat Benoit Saint-Denis at UFC Paris, and then ended up challenging Islam for the belt. We know he was scheduled to fight Neil Dariush on the undercard, but ends up fighting for the belt to save the main event. And he was facing Jalen Turner, who at the time came into UFC 300 after a violent knockout versus King Green. So Jalen Turner had a crazy hype going into this fight based off that, which isn't saying much because he beat King Green, but he added so much damage following the knockout. It was a pretty big moment where the ref didn't step in. So Jalen Turner comes to this fight versus Renato Moicano, and at one point in the fight, Jalen Turner knocked down Renato Moicano. He had him stunned and on the ground, but Jalen Turner walks away thinking he had the walk-off KO. But really, Renato Moicano was still in it, and Jalen Turner failed to finish him within the round. It ended up going to round 2, and Renato Moicano ends up TKOing Jalen Turner. So Jalen Turner kind of had the fight in his hands and fumbled it. But Jalen Turner had so much potential. Most recently, he lost to Ignacio Bahamondes and retired. So that has been the rest of the career for Jalen Turner. And for Renato Moicano, he's a top 10 ranked lightweight, also a great early prelim, great on the mic, had another win after this, and then ended up fighting for a title versus Islam. So really good to start off the night so far when you think about it with UFC 300. Then you got Sodiq Yusuff versus Diego Lopes. Now, Diego Lopes is going to be challenging Volk for a title. This was just the beginning. This was really the card that introduced a lot of people to Diego Lopes. In the first round, the TKO finish on Sodiq Yusuff, who at the time was ranked in the featherweight division. Diego Lopes comes in, had a little bit of a setback when he lost to Mavsar. He comes back, he beats Sodiq Yusuff, then beats Dan Ige, Brian Ortega. Now you see the momentum where he's now fighting for a title. He's a top-ranked featherweight in the world. This opened up the prelims of UFC 300. Diego Lopes is very well-rounded, just entertaining featherweight. So he has a little bit of star power around him now, especially if he does win the belt. You're talking about a guy who would be the featherweight champion opening up the prelims of UFC 300. to be determined. But yeah, so Diego Lopes is fighting for a belt now. Sodiq Yusuff, I don't think we've seen him since. Maybe he's taking some time away to reconsider what he's doing, just like Jalen Turner. But yeah. Then Kayla Harrison versus Holly Holm, another fighter who is now going to be challenging for a title. We assume that Kayla Harrison will be fighting Juliana Pena at UFC 316. So Kayla Harrison had some hype. She's an Olympic gold medalist. This was her UFC debut. So pretty big deal. They put her on UFC 300 versus Holly Holm, who we all know had the big fight with Ronda Rousey. And that's a pretty big women's fight. That was on UFC 300. Calvin Kattar versus Aljamain Sterling. Aljamain Sterling, another former champion. And this fight was his featherweight debut. This was the fight following his loss to Sean O'Malley. So Aljamain Sterling was a bantamweight champion for some time. He beat Cejudo. He beat Peter Yan. I mean, that was via disqualification, but then I think he beat him again in the rematch. Aljamain Sterling, a great bantamweight champion, maybe a top 5 bantamweight champion of all time. And he is in the prelims of 300, making his featherweight debut, and beats Calvin Kattar. And Calvin Kattar, also entertaining featherweight, has had some real slugfests in the UFC. But Aljamain Sterling kind of had his way throughout that entire fight. Kind of one of the more lackluster fights on this card. But if you have appreciation for high technical wrestling and grappling, that's what you get out of Aljamain Sterling, being the grappling technician that he is. And yeah, Aljamain Sterling, bantamweight legend here in the prelims. And then, bro, you know what's a crazy card when you got Jiri Prochazka as the featured prelim of a fight card? They had Jiri Prochazka, a former light heavyweight champion, as the featured prelim versus Alexander Rakic. And this was following Jiri Prochazka's first loss to Alex Pereira, which, of course, Jiri would then go on to beat Alexander Rakic and then get his title rematch versus Alex Pereira at UFC 303, which then he got completely head kicked again, and devastating loss for Jiri Prochazka. But then he bounces back and beats Jamal Hill. And Jiri Prochazka is one of the more popular fighters in the UFC. He was such a scary champion when he first had the belt after beating Glover. Just his look, his personality, the way he acts. Jiri Prochazka, people love Jiri Prochazka. He's one of the more favorite fighters of the UFC. This was a featured prelim for UFC 300. So that's pretty crazy to have this, and you didn't even touch the main card yet. I remember just all night, it was crazy. So Jiri Prochazka, featured prelim. And you look at this, I think it aged out pretty nicely considering who you got on the undercard of UFC 300. Then you go to the main card opener. The UFC was I remember there's a lot of backlash regarding this because the UFC was being pretty like confident to display Bo Nickel on the main card opener of such a card of UFC 300. You know, when you're trying to make a card like UFC 300, the UFC has to be strategic in how they place the fights and the cards. I mean, you're really being selective on who you place on this card. It's a big card. It's huge. So Bo Nickel, an elite college wrestler who comes in the UFC. He's undefeated. The UFC this is one of the most obvious examples of the UFC pushing a fighter, Dana White privilege, whatever you want to call it, giving Bo Nickel his shine on UFC 300, the main card opener. As we see, he also got the win versus Paul Craig at 309. So UFC keeps on putting him on these big cards. His next fight's up against the Ritter in UFC Iowa. So Bo Nickel submitted Cody Brundage. Cody Brundage, not really like a big player in the UFC, but he recently came off a good win on the UFC Fight Night. And Bo Nickel really displayed his wrestling here and submitted him. Kind of was probably one of the biggest favorites on the card. Most people did not. Yeah. So Bo Nickel. Then Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. I mean, this is self-explanatory. I don't need to go into. You guys obviously know how big of a fight this was. Charles Oliveira, the legend that he was, a former UFC lightweight champion, had crazy fight versus Islam Makhachev, beat Beneil Dariush to bounce back, and then has an incredibly close fight with Arman Tsarukyan. And Arman Tsarukyan in the beginning, Charles Oliveira in the first round of that fight, I remember he had Arman Tsarukyan in this crazy like chokehold, and I really thought Arman was about to tap in the first round. I really thought it was about to be as it's like Charles is like a snake. Once he gets you in his coil and he wraps around, there's no escaping. But somehow Arman held his breath. He works on his breath work, and he just got out. You see the camera angle, his face is trying so hard to fight for this, to keep this fight going, for this opportunity. And Arman Tsarukyan, and just mind you, I did not know who Arman Tsarukyan was before UFC 300. But you see this guy in incredible shape come in, Armenian, lightweight, and he comes in and he beats the legendary Charles Oliveira, a fan favorite, a superstar. I guess for us UFC people, Charles is a superstar. Maybe for the more of the world and the general public, he isn't viewed as such, but Charles Oliveira definitely is a star in the UFC. So Charles almost had a submission in the first round. It ended up going Arman Tsarukyan's way, and then Arman Tsarukyan was supposed to be fighting for a title next. That was the trajectory that Arman Tsarukyan was on, but as we know, he missed the opportunity versus Islam, and now he's not in the good graces of the UFC. The UFC wants to set an example. He might have to fight someone else now to reclaim his shot, and we won't maybe not see that fight. Still an incredible fight to be the second fight in the main card of UFC 300. Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. And then crazy that this was back-to-back. Just insane that this was back-to-back. Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. Do I even need to say more? Fight of the night. Performance of the night. Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway. Max Holloway, a former featherweight champion, one of the most entertaining. Both of these guys are two of the most entertaining fighters in the UFC. So Max Holloway comes up to fight at lightweight. They kind of call it an exhibition. It's for the BMF, which is kind of a gimmick belt that nobody really cares about, but it's just, I guess it's cool to have this kind of belt on the line, like who's the baddest motherfucker, you know? So Justin Gaethje, explosive power in his hands. Coming to this fight, I believe he was on a 2-fight win streak, right? He beat Fiziev and he beat Dustin Poirier. So Justin Gaethje, a fan favorite also. These guys are two of the most beloved fighters in the UFC. Everyone, and they're explosive. They have crazy entertaining fights. So, dude, this fight changed everything. When Max Holloway is running most of the fight. Let's just call it as it is, especially when he kicked Justin Gaethje in the head at the end of the first round, which set the tone for the rest of the fight. Justin Gaethje he had blood pouring from his nose, his vision. Max Holloway ended up doing his thing with this. But then in the final 10 seconds, the legendary point down to the mat, the final 10 seconds, Max Holloway knocks out Justin Gaethje in the last second of the fight. He was already winning. He was already up all the rounds. But then he goes and he puts it all on the line by pointing his fingers down to the mat and say, "Yo, Justin, let's put it all here." And they go and they slug rapidly in the pocket in the center of the octagon. And Max Holloway knocks out Justin Gaethje, leaves him on the floor unconscious with blood pooling around his mouth. Craziness, just mayhem, a frenzy. Everyone's going nuts. I remember my friends, we all went nuts. We all got up from our chairs yelling. And that moment was just crazy. Max Holloway, legendary moment. A moment I'll remember for probably the rest of my life. I constantly revisit that knockout. And props to Justin Gaethje props to both of them for putting on the kind of show that card needed. I mean, the night was already amazing, and then to have this fight the way it happened was crazy. So two phenomenal fights back to back. You got to look back at this card like it's just crazy. And then Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan. At the time, Yan Xiaonan was number 1. Zhang Weili was the prominent strawweight champion. You know, you give people a little bit of a breather after such craziness in the last 2 fights and the entire card overall by putting in a little champions women's fight. But Zhang Weili is probably what a lot of people like as the woman champion out of the 3. Zhang Weili is definitely probably one of the most skilled women fighters that we have, and she's fun to watch. And she ended up defending her title again at UFC 302. So Zhang Weili might be going down as probably the greatest strawweight, or one of them. So she co-mained UFC 300. And then you get to the main event. Some people were unhappy with this. Like, why is Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill the main event of such an event? People were wanting like McGregor or something. But yeah, and Alex Pereira, in his third fight at light heavyweight, he had the belt versus Jiri. He comes in and he chins Jamal Hill in the first round, does the famous shrug thing after knocking Jamal Hill. He gets kicked in the cup, but he decides to tell Herbazine, nah, F out of here. I got this. And then chins Jamal Hill with the left hook. Jamal Hill acting all cocky at the press conference. But Jamal Hill also was coming off an injury, like a year layoff after tearing his ACL. He was the former light heavyweight champion. So Alex Pereira, that was just one of the small stories in this chapter, in this legendary run that Alex Pereira had. And I hope that Alex Pereira could reclaim that gold in the rematch versus Magomed Ankalaev. So yeah, that is just looking back and in review, UFC 300, one of the most legendary cards we have received in the last decade. A card that really just truly made me into the fan I am today of the UFC. And it just was amazing when you look at all these fights. So yeah, let me know in the comments what your thoughts were. Where were you when you watched UFC 300? What you think of this card? And yeah, hopefully the UFC can deliver something like this one day. I mean, unless we gotta wait till UFC 400.